I am Milos Marjanovic. This will be an oral adjudication based on a previous discussion that we had about the practice debate regards to Module 2 of our judge training program. So let's begin. So this will be structured in a way that I'm going to present the call. It's only a top half debate, so I only have to tell you whether we think opening government or opening opposition wins. Then I'm going to explain the call and I'm going to explain how things clash, and hopefully this will be useful. Let's start. So narrowly after the discussion, we believe that opening government wins over opening opposition. Let's explain why. So opening government is bringing a couple of points to the table. One is that better knowledge that these technocrats are providing equals better policies, and they're trying to prove it on several levels. One is that taking issues seriously, understanding complex consequences of the issues, and the means of selection is better than in democracy. So we have a couple of responses towards this, which is one from LO, which is to say that we do have advisors, and two, the technocrats were not perfect in previous decisions like European Union, Singapore, etc. The problems with these two responses, even though they're valuable, is that it doesn't really get to the point of explaining to me the comparative and why advisors plus politicians are necessarily something that is, going to provide to us better results and better decisions. But also we have a response from Deputy Prime Minister towards this point, which is saying that it's not necessarily about knowledge, but it's about incentives that politicians have in appealing to lowest common denominator. So even when they do know a certain fact, this still doesn't mean that they will act on it and they will make a good decision. So this advisor point becomes less relevant because it was not explained properly. Second point about technocrats not being perfect is fine, but we still believe that it's not, fully, that it's mostly example based, and it's not, fully grasping the comparative of when democracies failed, which are also the examples from opening government like Bolsonaro and Trump. Deputy leader of the opposition also has some responses towards this, and especially towards the selection part of the technocrats, which is to say that people who are selected based on these KPIs like Deputy Prime Minister is talking about are usually wealthy, educated, and which necessarily means that they might pander to the others. The problem with a lot of these sets of responses, even though it's valuable, is that it's quite mitigatory rather than comparative, and rather than giving me the reasons why politicians would be better placed, or politicians do not have these traits of being wealthy, and pandering to people and elites around them, which is also coming from Prime Minister's speech. So when we look at this knowledge and better policy, better knowledge equals better policy, we do believe that even though there are rebuttal coming from opening opposition, still opening government takes this, and we're still convinced after this debate that the policy would be to some extent better. So we have another clash, which is representation clash, which is directly clashing with principal point coming from opening opposition. So the principal point coming from opening opposition is basically talking about the state has power over you, your happiness is dependent on the state, so government owes you, access to controlling them in this sort of situation. It perfectly clashes with this representation point, because opening government manages to mitigate the amount of control that you actually have with this system. And where opening opposition's material is lacking is that even though we're convinced that the state has power over you, that your happiness is dependent on it, and that, the state owes you something, their explanation in why you're able to actually control the state via this mechanism of democracy is quite underanalyzed and quite heavily mitigated by this representation point when opening government is talking about elections not representing everybody, dichotomy between liberal and conservative, and you not necessarily having, if you're not voting for a voting party, you did not really consent to the policies being passed, also long-term interests that are not there, and also minority representation. So to some extent it is mitigated by opening a government, and we don't have a proper analysis to say why it's significant, why this principle is so significant that even if with this mitigation we should still value it over everything else. So Deputy Leader of the Opposition correctly points out that they still have more consent on their side of the house. We are just unsure that this is a sufficient response if the consent is mitigated to the degree that opening government has managed to mitigate it to this extent. So after a principal point, we are convinced that there is some principle right, but we are not convinced why democracy is the best mechanism of achieving it. So the other responses towards this is coming from opening oppositions are regarding to this is whatever opening government is saying is actually the argument for more democracy rather than less democracy. The problem is it's left on there. Like we have some examples from Leader of the Opposition, but we never get a proper analysis on what are these instances of more democracy that you would want, but also why are they likely to manifest? Because obviously, insofar this is somewhat a theoretical debate, but it still has to have real-life boundaries, and it still has to be realistic that democracies could be reformed and could be done better through some of the mechanisms. Given that this analysis is not provided, this response is sufficiently, not enough for us to think this is a very super valuable point. The last sort of thing that can be clashed together to some extent is when opening opposition is talking about forcing people into the revolution. And this is like you're forcing people to endanger themselves and their assets in this situation. The problem with this point is that we are not sure how much, this is a hypothetical situation where people do want to overthrow the, technocracy. The problem is, from the get-go, does this not happen in democracy? Is the only way, is democracy so good that you don't have to ever use this mechanism? So it's already kind of shaky in terms of comparison. But also on the flip side, this revolution, we're not sure how fast it manifests. And we have some response from Deputy Prime Minister, even though we would want more responses, which is to say, if we have better policies, which they managed to win, as we said in the first part of the clash, then there will be less revolution overall and people will be more satisfied. Given that they win this clash, even though this response is not perfect, it's still to some extent adequate. We have one point that we can also clash with it, which is additional points coming from Deputy Prime Minister, which were underanalyzed but are there, which is a point about tyranny, which is like democracies are more likely to slide in tyranny because of the way people are elected. You can fake, you can falsify records, which but by having set records and set KPIs, you can't do it. And also corruption. So these points are admittedly not analyzed, but can be clashed with this revolution point to some extent, and somewhat playing into at least muddying the water and making this a more washy or more non-comparative clash. After seeing the analysis from both sides, we were convinced that this clash is less important than clashes coming before it, which is the clash about principle and representation, and clash about better policies. So we basically have to clash utilitarian metrics to some extent, and bringing utility with better policy, and the principle point. We do have a trying of weighing of these points from Deputy Leader of the Opposition, when he's trying to talk about why we should care about consent, because nothing has inherent value when everything that we assert value to is what human wills it. So we think this is a valuable point, but to the extent that opening opposition has a very shaky ground in this consent already being heavily mitigated by government, even though this weighing exists, we are not sure there is much consent to compare after the end of the debate towards this better policy. So if the points were better rebuilt, or if the points had more analysis towards why democracy is uniquely set to give you this consent and how democracies can be better, this would have been a much more valuable weighing rather than what in the end ended up in. So after the debate, even with this attempt of weighing, we are still convinced that there will be significantly on comparative level better policies, which means that people would be more satisfied. And given that the principal point about recourse to the state has not really proven, and it's heavily mitigated by opening government in talking about why most of the people actually don't have this recourse with the democracy. We believe that opening government, even though narrowly, takes this debate.